Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Is it the dulcet tones of Paul?
Garnette Cadogan, what a pleasure to have you on the call. I take it you were expecting my call, which is wonderful. I'm so glad, I'm so pleased, I'm so delighted, I'm so thrilled that you are part of the Quarantine Tapes. As I understand it, Garnette, you when I needed to postpone the call by a little bit to further read about your various walks, you told me that you were delighted that I would postpone because it would give you a bit more time to take another walk. So could you tell me a little bit what that walk was? Describe your most recent walk from which you just came back.
I went to the post office, which seems like a simple enough walk, but the post office that I went to is on a pedestrian mall. And so I got the chance of experiencing what so much of us are longing for now. They contacted other people, even from a distance, to see that vibrancy or signals of that vibrancy, to see and acknowledge others, even though my face was covered in a mask, to give that nod and to say, we're here and we hope to continue being here. To also go to the post office and to be reminded of what it means to connect. I love the post office for that very reason. The promise of connection, of being in touch with others. Yes, we're paying bills. Yes, we're sending packages for work. But as I was doing, some of us are sending letters. It's a way of trying to connect across a distance, a way of trying to close that distance, to close that gap, or as it feels now, a chasm, given how much we've been withdrawn from public space. But there's also a lovely chance for me to walk along the public space and to sometimes see some of the places in which, we connected, ice cream shops, concert halls, cinema, and to long for that reconnection, to have that remembrance, that there's a way in which we once connected very closely, shoulder by shoulder sometimes, all in this ritual of this shared joy, whether you're at a movie theater or you're at a concert or a theater performance, that you're all tied together in this ritual of, coming close together and giving over your imagination, your emotions to someone who's also doing the same with you, the performance that is.
Where was that walk? I mean, where
in Charlottesville, Virginia.
And that's where you live. I was going to ask you how these 3 or 4 months of quarantine have been for you. Have they all taken place there?
Yes, they've all taken place in Charlottesville, which maybe the longest I've ever been anywhere since maybe age 4 or 5. I'm known for being a wanderer, always on the move, always exploring, so much so that sometimes I'll jump on the train and the Amtrak attendant will say, hey, where have you been? We haven't seen you in a few weeks. So I'm known for, continually moving, for, always being on the go, the continual wanderer. But though wandering, there are certain places that are centers of gravity for me. New York City, my most beloved of cities, Boston and Cambridge, New Orleans. These are all places that I've lived and places I go to frequently, and in which, though I'm always on the go and always wandering, there are places in which I come back to be anchored, to be home, to have that recognition that we also value and need when we need to be reminded of who we are and why we're here.
When you speak always on the move, always moving, it reminds me of a delicious moment I had with Pico Aya in Calabash on Treasure Beach at the wonderful Calabash Literary Festival.
Oh, yes.
Certainly my favorite place to talk with anybody in public and in private. And I remember we were talking about the philosophy of travel, and I remember I was quoting to him, as is my wont, a wonderful essay by George Santayana, of the early 20th century, where he said that, plants are sedentary, they're rooted in the ground, but as Aristotle said, human beings have the intelligence of locomotion, to which the audience, I remember the 2,000 people on the beach, the audience there said, and it's a moment that Pico and I have never forgotten, because it was the most wonderful response of the audience. As I said, the intelligence of locomotion, they said, yeah, man.
Isn't that call and response wonderful?
It's fantastic.
And that's one of the reasons I love walking, because I think of walking as a kind of call and response, not only in terms of acknowledging those that you pass, but as you mentioned that quote with Pico, I think of that remark that Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, had made in his diary, if I remember correctly. I think it was his diary, where he said, "The ground is all memoranda and signatures, and every object covered over with hints." So part of walking is trying to find those hints, to see the ways in which the ground is memoranda, the ways in which people leave marks of themselves on the street, the way in which people give marks of themselves to you, the ways in which the public space is filled with stories, overflowing with stories. And so part of it is a way of trying to peel away and see those stories. And as you say, Jamaican Calabash, I think of the wonderful poet Kaya Miller, the Jamaican poet, who is a frequent guest at Calabash. And that line from his book about his book, The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion, where he says, "Draw me a map of what you see, then I will draw a map of what you never see, and guess me, whose map will be bigger than whose." And so to walk to see the memoranda, but also as a way of walking as a cartographer, to recognize that the public space, the world before us, is filled with layers, and that as we walk, we peel away those layers. We come in more and more in contact with those stories, and we extract stories that are there, or we exchange stories, or we leave ourselves open to stories. That by walking, you leave yourself open to the many possibilities, the many encounters that could happen. And therefore, you leave your own memoranda and you encounter other memoranda.
You mentioned Kai Miller, who serves as an epigraph, one of the epigraphs to Sarah Broom's beautiful book, The Yellow House.
Yes, that was the epigraph.
Yeah, it's The Yellow House. And, Sarah Broom book is all about another city that matters to you greatly, namely, which you mentioned, namely New Orleans.
What a lovely book that is also. And again, the way that book is so much about seeing. What does it mean to truly see a place? What does it mean to listen to the stories of a place? What does it mean not to subject this place to a single story, but to recognize that places are erupting with so many stories, and that part of our responsibility, but also part of our joy, is to give ourselves over to them and to go in search of them.
You mention a line of Kierkegaard I love, where he says, "I have walked myself into my best thoughts." What thoughts have you had recently on your walks in this time of the double pandemic?
I've been wondering what will happen to us when the virus has made its way away, or we've gotten back to what people might describe as normal, though I'm not sure what normal will look like after this. But the ways in which we've so withdrawn from public space, we've so withdrawn into our own spaces and have begun to gather online. That's the space in which so many people are now meeting each other. And when we haven't, when it's not this eerie absence in public space, it's marching in the streets, with protest, coming together in solidarity, making claims about human dignity, asking for racial justice, and bringing to the attention of so many things that's wrong with our society. So we either have a public space that's packed, but organized around thinking about what isn't wrong and what isn't right about our society, or we're at home and often coming to this new world in which we're gathering by way of Zoom or social media. And so out of my thoughts are, what is going to become a public space? These spaces are so important in thinking about the ways in which we acknowledge each other, the way we interact with each other, the way we see ourselves as part of in a shared vision, in a shared responsibilities, the ways in which we are connected to and see yourself in civic unison with each other, but also recognizing that all of the things that have been wrong, that people have been complaining about as they're marching in those protests, in inequality, lack of access for a variety of people, often along the vector of race. The public space is so important to us working through these things, to us seeing and recognizing not only our presence, but the kind of potential, enormous potential that we have to create things together or to oppose things together. The ways in which these spaces that bring people together in a physical space, and how it has a rich instrumental power, but we're now absent from it. What is going to become of us? How are we?
It's such an urgent question. I hear.
Yes.
What is to become of it? Which, in a way, is what kind of spaces are we going to create so that we become different? We don't go back to what passes for normal. And another way of phrasing this is: what kind of cities are you dreaming about? What kind of cities do we risk, Garnette, losing? What kind of cities do we need? What kind of density do we need?
Yes, density is one of the things I'm thinking of so much, because density is such a huge part of our creativity, of our, this coming together, our creativity, equality, seeing ourselves, coming together. And the less dense that these cities get, everything from, affecting mass transit to, or being able to work together to create accessible and equal public spaces, sidewalks, parks, streets, all of these that are important, and then not just design elements, but create opportunities, important social and economic and cultural opportunities. What will become of them if they're not dense, if they're absent of us and our participation and our mutual recognition? Then not only will we be impoverished, but we're also going to exacerbate some of the very things that had gotten people in the street protesting.
I want to take you back in time, Garnette, to your early walks in Kingston, in Jamaica, where you're from. You said, "I imagined myself as a Jamaican Tom Sawyer." What did that mean then, and what might it mean at this moment?
Well, part of it was Tom Sawyer's propensity for mischief, but part of it had to do with the sense of adventure and discovery and companionship, and more than anything else, whimsy. That one of the important things about wandering and about public space, and something that should not be lost in all the discussions about public space and its value, is that whimsy and serendipity is such an important part of our life. In these encounters, these surprise encounters, these chance encounters that allows us to encounter other people and have a richer sense of the world around us, but a richer sense of our very selves. And so imagine myself as a Tom Sawyer was imagining myself being able not merely to wander and to be in companionship with others and in mischief, mutual mischief with my friends, but to also have a sense of discovery which values these chance encounters, which values serendipity, which values whimsy.
Digression in a sense.
Yes.
The wonderful line of Adam Phillips, who says that digression is secular revelation.
Yes. Very true. And so, part of it is, that's how I'd seen it younger. But now that element of, Tom Sawyer that one might say lives on in me is the desire to have not merely digressions, but these chance encounters, that to have places inscribe themselves onto my imagination, which means people, place, stories, and then also in turn inscribe myself onto these places. So one thing, for example, of the arguments being had now over Confederate monuments, do they stay? Do they leave? What do they represent? What kind of meanings they have? And of course, in Charlottesville here, there was quite a bit of fights over the monuments, still ongoing debates about the monuments and the desire for a lot of people to have them removed, and others saying, well, we shouldn't remove them. They represent a part of our history, if even one that is the word criticizing. But one thing that has been lost in all these conversations is just how important it is that the spaces that we inhabit inscribe themselves onto our imagination, and that we feel ourselves a part of these places, attached to them, committed to them, beloved by and loving them. And so part of that movement in space is about having your imagination inscribed and also extending your imagination onto that place. And part of the discussions when we ask what alter public spaces to look like, what should our cities look like, what should we look like in them, are also questions about imagination. How do we imagine ourselves in a place, but how do we imagine others? That sometimes with the awful things we hear in terms of how people have treated others, we think, we need to send them and get training. And at many times, it's not a failure of knowledge so much as a failure of imagination, an unwillingness to imagine that someone should share a space with you. Imagine that they too are also part of your city, your suburb, your town, your state, your country. And in thinking about what will happen with these public spaces, part of what we'll have to think about is that what does it mean to design public spaces that will open up our imaginations? What
does it mean to live together? But please continue.
Yes. So I think, for example, of just the simple act of a few cities. I know New York City has done it, Seattle has done it, San Francisco and others have opened up more streets to walking. And so instead of our existence being organized around cars in which we're whizzing past each other, we're walking alongside, past each other, seeing each other, imagine each other as part of the same city, that our journeys and our destinations are more tightly bound up with each other. And so if we're fortunate, at our best, we can start imagining these public spaces, as profitable for the way we see ourselves and see each other, and the way we see us as connected. And so it will require an act of imagination. How do we design? How do we think of these public spaces, and that they're not just merely transition points, but they're also important destinations as to how we will connect.
What you're describing is so tough and so difficult to do in many ways. And I remember that just after Trump's election, you wrote a piece in which you quote Auden, who wrote, "You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart." Have you been able to follow that directive?
Sometimes. Sadly, too often, my crooked heart has made me see my neighbor as a hindrance or a bother or a frustration to bear or to deal with or to overcome. But that's one of the wonderful things about public life, the ways in which it can bring you outside of yourself. I'm hoping that I don't sound like a Pollyanna to say, just put us all in public space and we'll all love each other. But what I am saying is being in spaces that are open, accessible, common, safe, promising chance encounters that's more about encounter than escape, opens up the possibility of us not only acknowledging each other, but also sometimes seeing ourselves as having a shared purpose, that common space is in many ways a shared space, which can at times open our imaginations to suddenly not see us as us and them, but open up the sphere of who is considered us.
But you were saying a form of welcoming your neighbor, but often your neighbor, Garnette, as I understand it, and your work deeply speaks to that, has been a threat. Moving Garnette, the Tom Sawyer in Kingston, to the U.S., to New Orleans, and then to New York, you often felt, and I'm wondering how much you feel it now, that you needed to cross the street when you encountered somebody else because they were worried by the color of your skin. You write, as a walker in the United States, you've had to cobble together your own rules of engagement, particularly with the police. And I'm wondering what that has felt like now in these times of protest and in these times when people have taken to the street.
There's a special thing watching the news reports, watching and reading the news reports, and seeing in full views of cameras, police still behaving, with disproportionate force, with abandon, almost as if they don't care that the cameras are there, which also makes you think, if this is your behavior in front of cameras, how are you behaving when the witness of technology is not there? How are you behaving when you can't be seen? So in my walks, I still am very conscious of that also that lack of density makes me feel even more cautious, sometimes more worried. And also that's part of my concern about this withdrawal from public space, because the more we're away from common spaces, is the less prepared we are to re-enter them back, in which encounter becomes one of our guiding forces in moving through. And we enter back with fear. That so often when I discuss the bad experiences that I've had, just doing this mundane act of walking and the ways in which it has caused problems in our bad encounters with the police, it's often because people see me and then on the basis of my skin color assume that I'm a threat, and so they get afraid. And so too often I found that I was navigating public space, particularly at night, and in which I was calibrating my fear to other people's fear of me. And so you had me come in one side of the street and someone is coming, and we're both suddenly guided by fear rather than the joys of encounter, or rather than the two people looking forward to a chance encounter. And of course, that's a bit expected at times, that people will be afraid at night if, especially often if you have the experience of continually moving through public space where your vulnerability often shapes your movement. So my friends who are women have that experience where they have to continually organize their movements in public space, around the consciousness of their, vulnerability. And so walking at night and seeing a woman coming on the other end of the street I would cross, understanding the way in which vulnerability can change the way you experience public space. But then too often, I've found, with a variety of people that, and variety of genders that, what is guiding people is the color of your skin. And so, that makes me a little bit more aware now of the lack of, bodies on the street, or in other words, the lack of witnesses on the street that could keep the police in check. So it's there, but I try not to dwell on it or think too much about it. I find myself walking through and longing for the desire to connect, longing for more people, but also, lamenting just, how terrible the state of affairs have gotten, because it's one thing with people who are at home withdrawn, but also those who, are gone for good. I've lost a few friends and acquaintances.
Really?
Some to COVID, others just in a bad time, for them to have gone during this time. And so part of that walking is a kind of mourning, recognizing that also the people who had walked with before, that I'll no longer be able to walk alongside them. And so I, as it were, walk in the streets, longing for their presence, and sometimes walking, as I put it, among ghosts. The people who we know used to walk these streets will no longer be on these streets, but their marks are there.
So many different directions we could go into in closing. Maybe talking about this longing, and the way I'd like to conclude, sadly, might I say, our conversation is to talk about stoop culture. You've spoken about gentrification in terms of the challenges it poses to what you call stoop culture. You say, in stoop culture, there's a scrubbing away of the line between private and public. So tell us about that.
Yes. There's this lovely sociological theory that I've found myself reflecting on recently, called third places. It's coined by the sociologist Ray Holdengräber, and he talks about places where people spend time. Home is the first place. Work is the second place. You build relationships, you share experiences and stories. United in your joy, and then there are the third places. These places in which you build community, and you can connect regularly and with ease with other people. Parks, laundromat, hair salon, barbershop, restaurant, gym, temple, church, mosque, squares, and more and more and more. We need these third places, and these third places help give us a sense of connection or civic attachment. And our third space in some ways have pretty much become online now. And so I find myself longing back for these physical third places, because they're so crucial to building community. And we live in communities, and communities live in us. The other sociologists, Robert Sampson, have spoken about this idea of neighborhood effects, which said that neighborhoods live in us just as much and as formatively as we live in them. They change us as much as we change them. And even when we've left them, they still remain and cling to us and even, shape so much about our lives and our life's direction. And so my longing is for these third places now, these third places in which we can continue to build relationships. We can continue to, regularly and, with some ease, connect and get together with each other. And it's not the person who you will know their name and know their family history that sometimes gives you that sense of connection to the neighborhood. It's that guy who passes you every Thursday morning with his dog.
And who you see from your stoop.
Yes. And you nod and you laugh. And so just like the stoop culture, it's a way of cutting down that distance between inside and outside. That's what these third spaces do. And so the stoop becomes a kind of third space. So it's right in front of your home, but it becomes that place that opens up the public space and make the public space one that's welcoming, one that's in a place of encounter rather than a place of withdrawal. Right. Rather than the stoop being this distance between the public and the private, the stoop becomes a way of opening up a lot of the joys and the beauty of the private onto the public. Beautiful. And having the public, be that intermediary space.
Yeah, and it is like your outdoor living room.
Yes. And it builds community. It becomes a way in which somebody may not know your name, but they pass you every day and say, "How are you doing?" And they're like, "Fine." And they're like, "Hey, where are the kids? I haven't seen the kids." And you're like, "Oh, they've gone to visit their aunt in Atlanta." And then you're on your way. But these small graces, which cumulatively build community and create a sense of attachment and makes encounter something to welcome. Just to see and acknowledge somebody's joy. I tell you something which is quite funny. That a lot of people have been complaining, at least a lot of people have talked in Charlottesville, said, "Oh, I miss being able to smile to people. I can't see my face. I can't, talk with them because these masks are over my face." And I've said to them, well, one of the wonderful things about being Black in Charlottesville in this moment is that I just walk past all the Black neighborhoods and we have the nod, to a lot of Black people know that this acknowledgement with each other where you just sort of give a nod, the chin going up rather than nodding down. Your chin gives a quick movement up and back down to say, "We're here, we see you," a way of acknowledgement. And so that still continues to say, "Oh, the mask is on," but I keep walking through all these neighborhoods in which I know everybody will still be nodding to me, even though they can't see my mouth. And part of it is these traditions, these community building aspects, in which you find gestures, you find what are essentially acts of grace that make the public space, that make the outdoors, that make the sidewalks, the streets, the parks, the libraries, the restaurants, the bus, the subway, a place of beauty, or the possibility of a place of beauty. Just that encounter where you don't even know each other's name, but we've acknowledged each other and said, "I see you, you're there, I'm here, we're here together."
Garnette, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you, and I have to say that one of my longings is to take a very, very long walk with you someday, as we said we might at some point, and now perhaps even more so because we haven't been able to. I really long for that. In the meantime, I send you all my very best, and thank you so much for taking my call.
Oh, thank you, Paul, and thanks for that melodious voice, which just makes the evening all the more brighter.
Thank you so much. Take good care of yourself and stay safe.
Yes, you too, Paul. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.